All right, we left off before the break talking about phases, and phases where, let's recap this a bit. So, still work? No, went off. Phases are activating patterns or not. That has to do with activating patterns or not. And I ask you to create a schema with phases, and I'm not sure whether people did that. Anyway, this is the way to do this. You define phases, and in each phase you say which pattern need to be active, and then you write the patterns, and that's it. And as I told you, and I will show you that, let me close the other ones, that if you do this in Oxygen, then nothing happens. So I'm probably the so it's probably something wrong. Sorry again. I'm not sure what happens here, so sorry, let's skip this technical thing and move on to the next subject. That's probably easier. All right, phases. Anybody with questions about phases? No. Okay, good. Just a little side note, during the break, a thing came in from the chat from Huip Verbij that there is a Schematron something for JSON. And Dan, can you read? It's on the chat. You can look it up at the chat. But I'm not sure what the status is or how good it is or whatever it is. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, I have an answer from Menzo. He says use the XSLT 3.0 JSON to XML transform and base your Schematron on that. That was it.
Well, there's something wrong with my microphone, but all right. Let's hope this works better. Okay, these were phases. Another thing which is interesting in Schematron is that you cannot only reuse patterns, but you can also reuse messages. So you have a message that looks that is the same in several assertions or reports. You can centralize them in a central place and reference them so that you only have to write the message once, and when there's a grammar error in it or whatever, you only have to fix it once. So how does that work? In your assert here, why do these things never work if you want to? All right. In the assert, you write you use a diagnostics attribute as up there, and there it works, and you provide it with an identifier of a diagnostics, which you write at the bottom here. You have diagnostics, and the ID is message 1, and then there is the repeated message. So you can write the message, the text, only once and refer to it from asserts and reports and whatever. Using this mechanism, you can also output multiple messages, because the diagnostics attribute is a white space separated, can be a white space separated list of identifiers. So if you have multiple messages you want to output for a certain assert, then you can do that, which is actually quite a useful feature in several use cases. So I want you to do something with this. Please go to exercise 0303. And the idea is here that we have things and artifacts, and the type should be is limited to certain types. And I want you to reuse the message for both things and artifacts and let it and reference a diagnostic instead of putting the message directly into the asserts. And to help you, there's to start with, there's a basic schema that already does the validation, so you don't have to come up with this, and just change this schema into using diagnostics. Anybody succeed in? Yeah, I see a few. Okay, so let's have a look at the solution then. It's very simple. You have a you reference the message using the diagnostics attribute, and you write the diagnostic down here, which will output the right thing. There was also an extra question in the exercise to make these asserts output multiple messages, and I'm not sure whether people did that, but I will show you what that looks like. So what I did is I put the messages for the common message, but also the specific messages for things and artifacts here. And I reference them, for instance, in the assert for artifacts, I say, I want you to output the generic message and I want you to output the artifacts message. So what happens then is that multiple messages are output. And how that looks like is implementation defined. So depends what your processor wants to do. Maybe it puts the messages on a separate line. And if you do it in Oxygen, it concatenates the strings for you. That's what it is, with a space in between. So you should not rely on this thing always to come out the same, but this is the way to output multiple messages. There's another application of this mechanism that I'm not going into at the moment, is that you can put your messages in different languages, and you can select what language the message should be on output. But I'm not going into that at the moment, but that's another application of the diagnostics. All right.
Erik?
Yeah.
Erik, one question from John Lumley. Can you alter the order of the multiple messages? General first and specific second, for instance?
That's what's happening here. John Lumley asked, can you influence the order? Yes, that's the order of the identifiers in the diagnostics attribute. Does that answer the question, John?
No, it's a question of whether the Oxygen one basically gives me the text content of the assertion, and then it does the diagnostic. Is it possible? Right. Is there any way of doing it the other way around?
One moment. Oh. One moment. Snap even niet. Hij vraagt iets aan mij, maar ik wil het aan de zaal laten worden. John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to get you on the in the hall. That's nicer for everybody.
Okay, fine.
So that they can hear you.
Can you put John Lumley on the speakers?
Okay, can you hear me?
I don't think so.
Not yet.
All right, okay.
Nico? Gaat dit lukken? One moment, John.
Okay, fine, don't worry.
Can you put John Lumley on the speaker?
On the speaker? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. Okay.
They were sleeping.
In progress.
Okay.
Okay, could you try again?
Yeah, okay. in the oxygen, basically, it produces the text content of the assertion first, and then the generic from the via the diagnostic second. Is there any way of basically altering the order in which those come, or is that entirely implementation dependent?
Yes, that's entirely implementation dependent.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Okay, that was short. All right. So this was how you can reuse messages using diagnostics. All right. This concludes what I wanted to tell you about some of the more advanced features of Schematron, abstract patterns, phases, and diagnostics. And now we're getting into really deep water because we're going to talk about query language binding and XSLT. For those that were in Prague, this is going to be a repeat of what I presented in Prague a little bit. I altered it a bit, but if you were in Prague and you think, hey, I've heard this before, that's not a coincidence. Query language binding and using XSLT. What is actually happening? What's happening is that Schematron is a container language. It's a language in which you can configure the query language. So the language you use in the select expressions, in the context expressions, in the test expressions is configurable. And you, these are the various things that various expressions, and the language these expressions are in is configurable. And the way you configure that is called the query language binding. So that's also where the query binding attribute comes from. So we have a query binding attribute, and it's on the root element, and you say on it what query language binding it should take. There are a number of reserved and, strangely enough, only a few defined query language bindings. The ones in bold are defined, and the ones in normal typeface are reserved but not defined. I don't know, because from their name we could infer, I think we can all infer what the designers meant with them, but they did not define them for whatever reason. I've asked, and they had no, I could not get an answer that made sense to me. So we have EXLT and STX, which are too old to even consider. XSLT and XSLT2 and XSLT3, which means use XSLT1, 2, or 3, including XPath, X1 and 3. And you have the XPath ones, which mean things like you can use XPath, but not XSLT, whatever. In practice, there are only a few supported, which are XSLT, XSLT2, and XSLT3. Well, no surprise there. All the other ones, you can try the query binding attribute, setting it to some other value. It will probably complain or it will not work correctly. And as I told you before, my advice is use XSLT3 because that's the most modern one at the moment. If you don't specify the query binding attribute, you'll get XSLT, which means that all your XPath expressions will be XPath1, which is, I think we can all agree upon, severely limiting at this moment in time. And there's lots of things you can do with XSLT3 or XPath3.1 that you cannot do with XPath1. So don't do it, just put the query binding XSLT3 on your root attribute. Okay, so what does it mean? And let's have a look at the XSLT2, XSLT3 query language binding. You can use XPath2 or XPath3.1 expressions, and you can use the XSL key to define keys. And I'll provide you with an example of what that means and what you can do with it later. More importantly, you can add your own XSLT functions. If you have something really complex to check, or you want to go into other documents or whatever, you want to reuse code, that's the way to do it. I think the sky is the limit using XSLT functions, especially if your Schematron processor runs on Saxon. Saxon has lots of interesting extensions, like going to the file system or making direct, whatever. Lots of things, databases, database access. Peter knows all about that, how that works. Sky's the limit there. Officially, you cannot use other XSLT constructs. Officially, it's the standard, does not mention them. However, it usually works. And if we have time, I can also explain to you why it even works. So you cannot do an include and import, you cannot do XSL template, you cannot do global XSLT variables, but you can. It's a bit on your attitude against using or misusing standards, whether you want to use that or not. It works. All right. So let's have a little example of using XSL key, what that works. And there's no exercise for it, so you can all relax, right? Let's say we have an XML document with lots of items and lots of orders in something like this. And we want to check whether whether the IDs of the ordered items are actually defined, right? So what you can do here is first, of course, you need to do a query binding, XSL2 or XSL3. You have to define the XSL namespace here in the normal XML sense because you're going to use XSL instructions in your XML. That's a different thing from using the namespace in an XPath expression. You're going to use XML elements from the XSL namespace in your Schematron schema. So that's a different thing. So you have to define the XSL namespace in the normal way as it's done here. Then you say, I have a key. So I want a key based for all the items, for all the IDs of all the items. This is how you do that. I will not go into the specifics of this. That's all XSL. And when you've done that, you've created a fast lookup index of all the IDs. So you can very quickly check whether an ID is actually defined. And you do that by using the key function in XSL. Now, I'm not sure how often this is used in XSL style sheets. I've used it only a few times. But when your data sets are large and you have to look up a lot of IDs, this is really a very interesting feature of XSL. And it can speed up your Schematron processing extremely if you use it well. So this is how you use an XSL key. Let's go to defining a function, and there's an exercise for it, so please take care. Let's say we have another thing, XML document, right? And there's a price in there, and we want to check whether the things are priced correctly. And the prices are based on the type. And this whole thing is done in a external document, which links types to prices, right? And if the type is not mentioned, it should be the default price. So the first thing is okay. The second thing is off by one, probably, some VAT rounding error or something. It happens. The third thing is okay again. And the fourth thing, of which the type is not mentioned, should be the default price, but isn't. It's also off by 1 cent. So this is the basic setup. Now, if we want to have a Schematron that checks these things against this external document, you could do it with some elaborate XPath expressions, but I think it's much easier to write a function that just provides you the price based on the type of a thing, and that function goes into this external file and picks up the price. So here is how you do that. Again, we have a query binding. Again, we have to define the XSL namespace because we're going to use XSL elements. And here's the function. And I'm not going into how this works, but this works. Take that from me. And there will probably people who now say, yeah, but you used the wrong XSL instruction. You can do it more efficiently. That's not the point here. Another thing that's interesting is that XSL functions must be in a namespace, always. Otherwise, you can't define them. So you have to define some namespace for your functions. It doesn't matter which one. My personal preference is then use dash local or something, or in this case, functions, and I prefix this with F. But actually what's there is not important. It must be there, but what's there is not important. So this is the function. And then in the rest of your Schematron schema, you can simply refer to the fgetPrice function with the type simply by using the function name. So that's relatively easy. Is that clear? I hear nothing. So then I want you to write your own XSLT function, of course. It's a little, the function is a lot less complicated than the one I showed you. Here's the input file. And what I want you to do is, what did I found out? All right. There are some rules in there, and I want you to write a function that actually checks the rule. There's a schema. Yeah, what I want you to do is to change the, to move the asserts expression, this one starts with blah, 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 to a separate function, not because that's useful, but because it helps you learn how to write and use an XSL function inside Schematron. Those that do not want to type the XSL namespace, you can copy it from the instructions in PDF. All right, anybody succeeded in putting it into a function? I see no hands. So let's have a look at the solution then. So this is, it's a pretty simple function here. So what did we do? This is a wrong one. This one is invalid. Sorry. The XSL namespace is not defined. Oh, it's defined there. It's down there. It's on the XSL function. Okay. We define a prefix for the function. And we use some other things. We create a global variable called department code, which, by the way, we can reference inside our function, which is nice. We define the XSL function, and we use it down here to check the code instead of the code of the assert. Now, of course, in this example, this is overdoing things, but this is how you write an XSL function in Schematron. Questions, remarks? No. Yeah, Ken.
Peter asked if there are other subjects to talk about that, and they're completing your tutorial, and mine is specifically about external functions from Schematron.
Okay.
Would now be a more appropriate time to bring this up?
Let me finish the slides, and then we can take some extra subjects. Okay?
Okay, because the subject directly related to this.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, the Ken had some additional questions, remarks, and we're going to do that after I finish the presentation, because we have some time left. Okay. This concludes my tutorial. So what have we talked about? We have talked about Schematron which is a pretty flexible with regards to its query language. In practice, you can only use XSLT and XPath. You use it by setting the query binding attributes, and you can do XSLT keys and functions and all the other stuff unofficially. So this is what query binding is actually about and how it works. So, Schematron in general, simple, powerful. I hope you agree that it wasn't that Schematron is not that complicated. Maybe you couldn't follow along with all the exercises. If you put a little more time in it, it's really easy to master. Patterns, rules, asserts, reports. You can tailor your messages. Mechanisms for reuse. There are more mechanisms than I mentioned here. Abstract rules. You have includes some like so. There are more mechanisms than I mentioned here, but the abstract patterns and diagnostics are the most important one. And you can use XSLT. So, time for a little commercial break. I wrote a book about Schematron. It's for sale on Amazon.com or on the URL at the bottom. Please all go and buy my book. I had 2 copies with me, but for sale, and I already sold them. So sorry for all those people that wanted to bring a book with me. I do have 1 copy of the export book with me. So if anybody's interested in that, I can sell it to you. Right. So this is it. Any questions in general? No? Ken, maybe you could get the microphone.
Well, 1 moment, please. I had a question from Tom Hillman via Slack.
Yeah.
And he said, apology if I missed it in a distracted moment, but I hear Erik Siegel talk about abstract patterns. Did he also cover abstract rules? Gerrit Imseke sent him an answer, but I didn't get back from him if that answer was sufficient.
Yeah.
And the answer from Gerrit was, 4 replies.
Well, the direct answer to the question is no.
Okay, well, then it's okay. Okay.
No, I did not talk about it because abstract rules are not a very useful feature.
Shall we try it again, Ken?
Yeah, Ken?
Before you leave your, go to Slack, I sent you 2 links in a direct message Slack channel. So you want to okay.
First of all, thanks very much, Erik. Now, as there's a bit of time left, I asked a few people whether they had things that they were using in Schematron that might not have been covered here, and that might be a nice addition to Erik's tutorial. So Ken, please come and tell us what you think can be added.
There are 2 links.
Yeah.
And in one of the projects that I'm on, I'm synthesizing the Schematron from user input from a bunch of people who don't know a lot about Schematron or XML. And so I have a Google spreadsheet, which is the
First one?
we can go with the first one, but we'll have to scroll down one.
Yeah, the Wi-Fi is
Yeah,
right.
yeah, scroll down till we get to a number. Keep going, please. Keep going. The next diagram. Okay, so stop. So we have the authoring of the Schematron expressions is being done in a Google spreadsheet. And then that gets exported and into an XML vocabulary that is a sparse table vocabulary called generic code. And I'm using Xatapult in order to create the Schematron. Now, there are functions in those assertions. If you could go back to Slack, there's a second link. Thank you. This is working out better than I thought. And if you could scroll to the right, we got Schematron context, and the next column is Schematron assertions to the right.
Right. Can you,
Yeah.
oh, there.
Yeah, there's the scroll bar. Up top.
Schematron assertion. Yeah.
Yeah, and left one so we can see the context and the assertion. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. And we have a function here, BPC code list. And as Erik has taught us, the typical way that you would address that is by writing the function in the Schematron script. And that was too awkward for me because BPC code list is a synthesized style sheet from a whole bunch of code lists and their members. So back to the diagram, please, which is yep. So what I've done is I've gone through all of the steps of Xatapult in order to produce the XSLT from the Schematron, but then that is imported in a wrapper style sheet, and the wrapper style sheet imports the synthesized BPC code list implementation. Because XSLT can be imported into other style sheets. This allowed me to greatly simplify the generation of the Schematron because there's no declarations of functions or anything at all in that fragment And that creates an XSLT that can't run on its own, but it can be imported in a shell style state that pulls in the implementation of all of the functions needed in that right-hand column of the spreadsheet. So as an alternative to using XSL function, you can embed it. You can embed the result.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Maybe I can add a war story from myself then in using Schematron, is that I was asked to create a Schematron from an XML schema because the users didn't understood the messages. So I took the schema, which was really pretty complicated, but very standardized. So with an XSLT style sheet, I generated a Schematron file and generated more user-friendly messages from that. And I wouldn't recommend doing that by hand because a simple schema rule like this element is optional and it can have so many instances actually explodes into a number of Schematron asserts. So you should really, it's doable, but don't do it by hand. That's the idea.
Erik, can I ask you to say a few words? There's the mic.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, I think you asked specifically about HTML in reports. So from time to time, we write HTML in the assert or report output so that people can get links in their report that points to in-depth documentation, or we can have an HTML list with suggestions there. And we typically embed that in HTML reports where you have a rendering of the input, for example, a Word file or an InDesign file. And then we place the error messages at the respective locations where they have occurred. And this is an approach that I accidentally presented 7 years ago here in Amsterdam. And unfortunately, I didn't do the final subversion commit for my slides. So my slides that I have here on my laptop, as I just found out, are outdated, and the actual slides are probably lost, unfortunately. But as I'm standing here, I want to make another point, if I may. You didn't cover the role attribute on assert and report, but this is particularly for Oxygen users, this is a useful feature because Oxygen has tied a specific semantic to these attributes. They use it as a severity attribute. Role has no predefined semantics, but they use it for the error level, error or warning or info. And it's good practice if you want to make a distinction between warnings and errors, then you can use role equals warning, and then Oxygen just attaches a yellow wriggly line to the error location. So this is a useful feature. Not everyone will probably interpret the role attribute in the same way as Oxygen, but if you use Oxygen, then it's useful. And in that context, as you were talking about abstract patterns, the role is not something that can be filled in with a pattern value. So there's no variable substitution there. Schematron doesn't do it, but Oxygen uses a patched version of the skeleton implementation, and they enabled that, and we use that also quite a lot, that we can have certain messages, and for some customers they are errors. For example, in EPUBs, if the image is larger than 2 megabytes or whatever, for one customer it should be reported as an error, for the other only as a warning. So we rely also on that Oxygen feature.
Okay.
So those are my 2 cents.
I think this is another, this afternoon I did the Schematron on it itself and didn't want to go into the Oxygen implementation of it, which is indeed more extensive than what Schematron allows. But I think the cause of that is that because the Schematron standard is sloppy. And I sincerely hope that the next version will be a lot better and a lot stricter, so that we can actually do not have to have these things like, oh, Oxygen does it this way, Schematron does it that way. It should be one way according to the standard.
Are you part of the committee?
No, it's an ISO committee. So I'm not a member of ISO, but I hope I get invited as an external expert. Anyway, there is also a Schematron enhancement proposals list. I don't have the URL at hand, but if you Google on Schematron enhancement proposals, you'll probably find it, in which we gathered and commented on all kinds of enhancement proposals for this new standard, if you're interested.
Done.
Okay.
Nico, wil je Gary unmuten? En in beeld.
Good afternoon or morning. I'm uncertain. I'm 6 hours away from Amsterdam. My question during the presentation was the order in which diagnostic messages would be produced. Is it implementation dependent?
So the other thing that was mentioned that in the chat was that there is a JSON implementation of Schematron, JSON-tron, as some PhD thesis or another bit of art, but it hasn't been worked on for 4 years, but it might be interesting for non-XML people who want to try on Schematron.
No.
We're having some issues with Zoom. It doesn't work for some reason.
Okay. Maybe you can read it aloud, Dan, and with the mic,
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was a question from earlier, one of the earlier slides. The diagnostics attribute of schema assert can be multi-valued, white space separated ID ref. I don't know if these will be processed in the order in which the ID refs are specified.
the answer is yes, they will be.
The answer is yes, they will.
They will, yeah.
Okay.
So maybe it is time to wrap up now. And well, thank you not only Erik, but also Gerrit and Ken for their additions. I think we have a bit of time for a quick coffee, and during which time Yuri and Jörn are going to set up their tutorial of 4. So after declarative data and declarative validation, we're going to declarative forms and applications. So let's see each other back in 15 minutes sharp.